And maybe before that, Cal, it might be a good idea for you to give everyone an introduction of yourself and your book, right?
Sure. Let's see, where does it start? I guess, well, I'm no longer at Zora, which is the company where I wrote the book and the experience the book was based on. So I can go into that later. But I mean, I was the head of the data science team at Zora for, well, like 5 years, since before they IPO'd until I guess we're like 2 or 3 years post IPO now. And one of the things I did while I was there is I worked on churn for a lot of different Zora customers, because every customer of Zora, of course, has a churn problem because they're all subscription businesses. Although, I mean, I like to say that nowadays every company in the world has a churn problem, because pretty much all businesses want repeat customers, whether it's retail purchases or in-app purchases, or just followers on your YouTube channel. Pretty much everyone has a churn problem nowadays. So it's gotten really broad beyond just subscription. But I guess subscription was where people first recognized it. I guess more about my background. What can I say? I did a PhD in kind of neuroscience with AI, which sounds sort of normal to say that nowadays, but actually when I did a PhD in that area, it was not such a common choice. It was kind of before, neural networks had taken off again. After that, I actually worked on Wall Street for a while. I had the great foresight to join the finance industry in 2007, shortly before it sort of imploded. But it was a very interesting, career experience, and it was all good. But then after being on Wall Street for a while, I because I had done machine learning in my graduate school, well, when I went to Wall Street, there was no such thing as data science. I mean, there was no jobs for data science when I finished. Although when I was interviewing, I was actually made a decision between machine learning jobs and Wall Street job, and maybe unwisely, I chose the Wall Street job, but hindsight is 2020. But anyway, during the time I was on Wall Street, that was when data science became a thing. And since I had done machine learning, back in the day, it was kind of a natural transition to get out of finance and into data science, where the first company I worked at when I became a data scientist was trying to do churn. So it was actually even before Zora. I was at a small startup that was trying to do a product to help with churn. And well, that startup didn't do too well, but based on that experience and my connections from the company, I moved to Zora, where they also did a lot of churn work. So that's kind of the whole background. So I was going to say, I have like 2 presentations, one that I gave at a data science conference, and it has like more, some actual code in it, and one presentation that I gave at SaaStr, which is more just like the general interest presentation.
Yeah. I think the general one probably is better suited, because we have wide range of people. We have product managers, analysts, sales, customer success, marketing, just everyone is interested in this topic.
Sure. Okay, then I can kind of quickly go through the presentation that I gave at SaaStr. It was actually just about a year ago, which you'll see from some of the data. Let's see. I can share my screen. And there's this first slide with a video. I'm not going to show you the video. You can find it on YouTube if you look to see that there's like a video at the start of this, which with rock music that makes being a data scientist look like, whoops, I'm not trying to share this. I'm trying to present this. I got the wrong button there. Okay, so this is the presentation I gave at SaaStr Scale last year. I don't know if anyone went to that. Of course, it was a virtual event. So I start out with what is churn. We can probably I can really skip this one at SaaStr also. It's like anyone who's at SaaStr Scale is going to know what churn is. So, but I usually start out with a slide anyway. Does anyone want to talk about what churn is? Probably not, right? Let's go to, okay, what is fighting churn with data? That's the book. I don't have to promote my book to you guys. What is Zora? Also, I don't think I have to tell you guys about Zora, really. Do I?
We're a Zora customer as well.
Yeah. So lots of, it's pretty much the who's who of the SaaS world at this point. All right, so this is actually where we get into some of the actual content. This is data on typical monthly churn rates for SaaS. And this is from the Subscription Economy Index. Actually, hold on a second. Someone's like mowing their lawn right outside my window. I'll be back in just a sec. I'm just gonna.
No worries. And by the way, everyone, we have an agenda doc. So if you have a question for Kyle, feel free to add it there. I am going to send it into the Zoom meeting chat. Yep.
Cool. All right, well, I have my noise situation under control. So there's a document that they published. I mean, I used to publish the Subscription Economy Index, and they still do this. So you can get updated versions of these numbers by going to Zora. So at the time that we did this, the median churn was 2% per month, bottom 10% is 5%, and the top 10% is, as you can see, 0.6%. So you really see a huge range just on the Zora platform. And the key thing to remember is it's not like, it's not that it's good companies and bad companies, because there's so many variables that affect churn rates. One is if you're B2B or B2C. Generally, a consumer product will always have higher churn, although there are exceptions like Netflix, of course, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Company maturity, very important. More mature companies, almost always lower churn. You have some very high growth companies in the early stages also have very high churn, and that can be okay, for early stage. Also, where you operate, I say market segment here, that's not really clear, but for example, from the Zora data, we had customers whose business was largely in Latin America. And guess what? They had high churn rate, than a comparable business operating in Europe or the United States. So there's so many things that can affect your churn rate. It's really important to make sure you get an appropriate benchmark if you're trying to, compare yourself. So for GitLab, you would really want to look at B2B SaaS companies at a similar stage of development. And don't compare yourself to consumer companies or even public companies. I mean, this is annual churn rates. This is exactly the same data, just converting it to annual. So the median is around 20%. Top 10% is down below 10%. Also, public companies that report churn are generally reporting less than 10%. That's like your Netflix. I think Disney Plus is also, well under 10%, although some of them are not. They don't have all that data. This is all from Zora data. And again, so there's just a really big range that you see. Any questions or comments, or should I just keep going?
Carl, real quick on the churn. This is churn across all segments within those customers, correct? So if a subscription, if a SaaS company is selling something, it's taking into account any SMB, mid-market, enterprise, and this is a cumulative.
These are annual
slice.
and it's going to be revenue based.
Right, but your point about like, hey, you got to be careful about comparing yourself to publicly traded companies and everything else.
Yep.
Where I'm thinking about like our average revenue per customer.
Mm-hmm.
And how that can slide up and down based on whether you're selling to the SMB market, the mid-market,
right,
enterprise, contract size, all that. But maybe you'll get into that.
Yeah, well, generally it's always the case that the bigger your customer is, the less they churn. And so SMBs are more like consumers, and bigger. But this data takes every company and just calculates an overall churn rate without, it's impossible. If you haven't seen the subscription economy reports that I used to do, it's pretty much taking every Zora customer as an anonymous sample, aggregating all the data, and then calculating the churn rate. So we would only calculate one aggregated churn rate for each tenant. And it was only one calculation. We used like an annualized calculation, even for consumer companies, where that wasn't really the right churn rate for a consumer company, because usually consumer, you look at monthly churn, and B2B SaaS, you'll look at annual churn. But for this study, we calculated everything as annual churn and then just turned it to monthly for comparison when we wanted to.
Cool. Hey, Carl, quick follow-up to that. Did you see any like cool correlations between net revenue retention and gross revenue retention? So maybe startups that had significantly higher gross churn, but they also were the ones that were leading the way when it related to net because they were expanding their existing base so much.
I don't remember exactly. We definitely saw a correlation between high growth and high churn.
Okay.
So early stage companies that were growing very rapidly. Yeah, and we would, this was Zora. We would see like 50%, 80% growth, 100% growth. We saw that kind of data routinely, but they often went with a high churn rate. So at one point we said, oh, maybe companies with low churn rate grow faster, right? That would be your cause and effect reasoning. If you lower your churn rate, your growth should go up. Actually, we saw the opposite, that the higher the growth rate, usually the higher the churn rate, if you just look at the data all else equal, because then who has that high growth rate? Early stage companies. Who has high churn rate? Well, a lot of companies have high churn rates, but early stage companies have high churn rates. So we generally saw churn and growth rates correlated positively, which, well, that wasn't what people were hoping to find, but you don't always find what you want in the data. Probably if you controlled it along for the type of company, you might find that, oh, lower churn leads to higher growth, but you really have to control the sample for that. So anyway, this is still all based on Zora data, not from the book. This is just showing what happened to churn during COVID. It was, and this shows you when I stopped doing this, and this was the last time I did this at Zora. There was a high point in churn. The highest average churn rate for the past couple of years was Q3 of last year, but it wasn't like that bad in a way. And what we observed at Zora was we had a lot of companies whose churn went up, but you know what? Zoom is a Zora customer too, and their churn went way down. And a lot of Zora customers also had churn go way down because they were part of the solution for working from home. So overall in the Zora data set, it was just coming out a little bit up, but not, not like a churn apocalypse or anything due to COVID. So, okay, this is actually getting into the content of the book, which is first just to summarize, what are data-driven churn reduction strategies? First one I always like to say is having a great product, because if your product is great, people won't churn, right? And of course, you can the data part is figuring out what are the most engaging and sticky features without doing surveys. Because your churn data is like a survey that every customer takes. They only answer one question. It's churn or renew, but every customer takes it. So it's a great, if you see it like a survey like that. Also, marketing is for reducing churn by giving people information that they really want, trying to target the messages so that you're, not just spamming people. Also, whoops. It's two at once. Well, the first one was customer success. Obviously, you guys know about that. Sometimes I have to explain what customer success is. And obviously, using data to target people for customer success is important, especially when you start thinking about, strategies which have a cost associated with them. If you're just emailing people, the only cost is you might drive them away. If you're actually doing customer success, you're going to have to, there are costs associated with doing training, making onboarding documentation, and all the things that customer success does. On pricing, the message is always not to discount to reduce churn. Everyone thinks that from the cable company experience, where if you threaten the cable company that you're going to leave, they give you a discount, right? I mean, who's had that happen at least once in their life? But that doesn't work. Once obviously the consumers get the message, they can just threaten you to get a discount. And also the cable companies were coming from a monopoly pricing position. Like the old price that people paid for cable was based on their monopoly. So they could always give people a discount to compete with satellite and the internet and still have a positive margin. But most SaaS companies are not in that situation where, oh, sure, we'll give you a discount, But anyway, the thing to do is, of course, obviously GitLab does this already, is having tiered pricing. So people who want just a little can use just a little and still get a good deal. Lastly is targeting, which is figuring out where your best customers tend to come from and get more from that channel. I always say this is like the weakest form of fighting churn, because for one thing, you're not actually retaining your existing customers and you're not actually making your product better, but also usually no one can get all the customers they want from one preferred channel or from the one channel that gives them the best. So it's always just, it's just one tool in your toolkit to do that kind of targeting. Let's see. So that's more of the background. So why is churn hard to fight? It's hard to predict, even with AI and modeling, for a number of reasons, in my experience. I mean, the reasons people churn are very subjective, and you have limited information about why they're really churning. It's better with B2B. You might have more info, but still, there's also always a lot of random timing. And if this is, I'm sure we've all done this, where you forget to cancel a subscription you're not using. Because then what does the data-driven algorithm at that company say? It says, oh, Carl's a risk. He hasn't watched a video in 4 weeks. Oh, Carl's a risk. He hasn't watched a video in 8 weeks. Why doesn't that guy churn? Oh, he forgot, So a churn model, is less also common with B2B. Usually B2B are more rational, but still you'll have some B2B customers where you look at their data and you're like, what is wrong with these people? Why don't they churn? They probably just haven't gotten around to finding a replacement, or they have bigger fires to fight and they're going to churn as soon as they, have the IT resources to migrate, So it's also hard to prevent churn because these are customers who know what you're selling. So it's not like marketing where a better message will actually sway them. So you actually have to deliver some more value to move the needle on churn. And I make a joke, there's no silver bullets for churn, meaning a low cost and effective method. The joke is there's a diamond bullet. You just reduce your prices and you'll reduce your churn, but I call it a diamond bullet because it works, but it's too expensive. You can't afford it. And really, it's just another way of losing money. If you have to reduce your prices to reduce churn, you're losing money that way. So it's not really a churn reduction. It's just, shifting it, I guess, where the source is. And lastly, well, as we can probably see from this call, churn is hard because it's multi-team, and customer success is often said, oh, they own churn, like quote, own the churn metric. But the truth is, in many companies, it's also the product and the marketing and the pricing, which are all, going into churn. So, well, yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of risks there of people not talking to each other, using different metrics. But yep. So let's see, going through more AI for churn. I say, and I'm a data scientist and I do AI for a living, but AI is only a little bit helpful with churn. And well, definitely only for organizations that are already using advanced analytics. So if you're already doing stuff with AI and you want to do a churn model using AI, then it's like, great. But if you're not already doing AI, don't rush to use AI for churn. It's not just about the accuracy. Let me just get all these things out. It's that an AI algorithm can tell you who's most at risk for churn, but it's not going to do a good job targeting them for, for a particular intervention. I mean, it would be really, you'd have to be a very advanced company to be using your analytics to target your interventions, but also your interventions need to be designed. Like, let's say your intervention is going to be an email campaign that will highlight good features. Well, AI is not going to write that email, and AI is not going to tell you who to send it to. And you need to send the email about features to people who aren't using the features, which is, so your data on the who's using what features is going to be really useful, but not the AI, that will just flag people at risk. Also for same things like, your pricing strategy and your product market fit, AI is not going to tell you how to change your product, which is really the best way to reduce churn, is always, the best product is the best way to reduce churn. So what do you do with data? In the book, I focused on what I call customer metrics. And if you're in the data science profession, you call this features or feature engineering. I don't know if anyone's in that line of work. I avoided in the book saying, features and feature engineering, just because if you're a software company, it can get kind of confusing. Are you talking about the data features or the product features? So customer metrics should be easy to understand. And well-designed customer metrics do predict churn and retention, as I'll show you in like the next slide. So it's not that there's no predicting of churn, it's just not using an AI model to do it. And your customer metrics are also what you can use to do your targeting. So take like an email that's going to promote a product feature that you think is really sticky and engaging. Well, if you have a metric of who's using the feature, you can use that metric to target people for that email campaign. Or if it's an onboarding training for people, a certain feature area, you can, if you're measuring who's using what, you can target people who need help with that product feature. So let's look at the case studies now, and the rest of this will be case studies. This is Broadly, a Zora customer. Well, Broadly, it's a little confusing when I explain their business. So it says Broadly ensures your business looks great online and is found by potential customers. Broadly manages reviews. So if you're ever at a website and it pops up a little box that says, will you review this place? It's probably Broadly or maybe a Broadly competitor. I don't even know. But that's what Broadly does. It gets people to give reviews. But the thing to remember is the Broadly customers are businesses. So this is B2B, and it's consumers who are giving the reviews. And they have events in their system which are called promoter and detractor. This has nothing to do with NPS score. So this is not about NPS. Promoter in Broadly means your customer gave you a good review. So it's not the Broadly customer reviewing Broadly, it's Broadly's customer's customer reviewing Broadly's customer, because that's what Broadly's customers want to do. They want to get good reviews from their customers. So there are metrics for promoters per month and detractors per month, which is just the good and bad reviews that the customer of Broadly is getting from Broadly's customers' customers. So this is what happens when you look at the number of positive reviews per month that they get on Broadly. And this is a simple example of using a metric to tell you something about churn by looking at customers in, well, I call it cohort analysis. Usually cohort analysis is based on a time. They all signed up in the same month. This is actually cohort analysis based on they all have a metric in a certain range. So the bottom cohort is all the group of customers who have basically 1 or 0 promoters per month. And then the next cohort is like the next decile. I don't think there's 10, but they're designed to be equally sized. And so as you can see, the more good reviews per month, the less churn. So this is good. And this is what you should expect to see for really whatever your important product features are. I've seen it at so many different companies that if I don't see a chart that looks like this, then like something's wrong. Usually something's wrong with the data, I don't show you the churn rate here because that's Broadly's confidential information. And that goes for all the other case study charts. I won't show you the actual churn rate, but this is the right relative scale. So the people who are healthy customers have, well, about 1/4 of the churn rate of the unhealthy customers in the bottom cohort. And you usually see an elbow like this, where whatever the metric is, it helps for a while, and then beyond a certain point, it actually doesn't continue to reduce churn. That's also really standard in these. Okay, so that was good reviews. What about bad reviews? If a Broadly customer gets bad reviews, are they going to churn from Broadly? Well, let's look. Actually, if you look at it this way, it looks like bad reviews also reduces churn. So this is customer detractor. That's the number of bad reviews they get per month. And it's a little bit weird, actually. Why do more bad reviews lead to less churn? It's a trick question, which I'll give you the answer to on the next slide.
They're feared, they're scared. They want to monitor the situation when they see bad reviews.
They need more reviews at that point.
Or I think customer might want the actual truth.
Actually, okay.
Could it be because if they're getting a lot of reviews, they're also getting more bad reviews?
That was the right answer.
Wow.
Right? Dave, you get the prize. Yes. It's basically the bigger customers. So if you get 100, well, basically going back here, let's see, how do I go? Wait, oh, there we go. If you go back here and you're one of these people who's getting 80 reviews a month, Well, you're probably somewhere up here on the curve too, because you get a lot of reviews, you'll get a few bad ones. So the trick then is in your metric design. Here, instead of looking at the number of bad reviews, you look at the percentage of bad reviews. And now you see what you were expecting to see, that the more bad reviews, the worse it is. But you have to look at the bad reviews as a percentage of the total. Or when you look at this one, you'll get fooled by the correlation. And it's really common in all of this work because most companies, yeah, we have a lot of behaviors which are correlated. And where good users who use the product a lot do a lot of everything. So you actually have to look at these kind of comparison ratios to see the influence of, well, actually even to figure out what's bad. So there's other examples, okay, like this. So this is broadly, this is where their top churn fighting moves. Okay, so the customer success actually uses the customer metrics also to talk to the customer. So when they're having a call with a customer, they'll pull up a dashboard and be like, oh, I see your number of bad reviews like went up last month, you know, and they just use it as like a talking point to engage with the customer. Also, many companies do this. They just ignore the people who are most at risk. Like going back to this slide, you just ignore these people here who have like 0 or 1. You know, they're usually not savable. Unless you have a lot of resources, maybe, but it makes more sense to focus at the people who are in the middle, but not at the healthy level and try to move them up the curve, you know. Also, sticky features are very important. They found that integration with a booking system was very sticky. And now they prioritize it in the setup. And I think a lot of people find like booking and accounting systems are very sticky. So if you somehow integrate with their booking and accounting system, that's usually a good play across different SaaS categories.
Hey, Carl, you mentioned that AI doesn't really help from a detecting churn. Have you used AI to detect the appropriate customer success metrics? Because it's sounding like customer success metrics are the most important thing. So could you utilize some sort of algorithm to figure out the right things to measure?
It's hard. Yeah, I mean, first of all, AI does predict churn. It just doesn't help you reduce churn unless you follow through with a targeted action. The problem, gotcha. I don't recommend actually automating the discovery of the best metrics either, because it's a big theme I talk about in the book, maybe I don't really say it in this slide deck, is that usually it's pretty obvious to people who know the business because it's whatever gives customers value or utility, you know, in economic terms, or they say engagement, you know, or the magic moments, you know, and you know, I don't work at GitLab, but I'm pretty sure your most important metrics are going to be things like how many repos do they manage, how many pipelines, how many check-ins, how many merge reviews, because that's what people are paying for when they use GitLab. So those are some form of those. And the thing is, you can also usually can't measure the value that people get directly, only in some cases. Because, I mean, really people using GitLab, what do they really want to do? They want to make money from their software companies, usually. That's actually their true goal, right? They want their software company to be a success. And you probably can't measure that directly. I'm trying to think if you could. Zora was very different because in Zora, well, Zora was in an enviable position for churn. This is kind of going off the talk track here. But Zora, our customers, or their customers now, they want to make money. And in Zora, we actually measured how much money they made because it was running through our system. So we actually knew how much money they made and how much they paid us to make that money. So at Zora, we had a very great insight into who was likely to churn. Although you still couldn't stop it always, because if they weren't making money on Zora, we didn't have a magic wand that would have them make more money either. So, but so usually the reason I don't recommend AI for figuring out the best metrics is it's usually, well, first of all, it's constrained by what you're tracking. So you're going to start by looking at all the events you're tracking. And then it's just common sense, like the most valuable events for users of the system. I mean, you might get some surprises when you actually do this kind of analysis. But yeah, there's always a few surprises, but you usually just start with the things that you know, and this quantifies it. And we'll show you those weird things with, oh, actually, how disengaging are the disengaging things. All right, anyway, let me keep getting through the stuff in the deck. There's 2 more case studies. Clipfolio is a BI tool, basically for making dashboards. And so the events in their system are things like viewing and editing dashboards. We'll also look at metrics for account tenure or age, active users per month, and seat utilization is another good one. So this is the time-based cohorts for Clipfolio, which is also, I mean, it's really, like I said before, the sort of normal cohorts are based on the time that you sign up. But this is portraying it in a way similar to the previous. So this shows actually a pretty standard thing for a SaaS company. I think that was one of the questions in the document, was about the time profile. And it's actually, this is pretty common for the first year, that, well, churn does peak at 6 months, and then it goes down in the 3rd quarter and then comes back up again at 1 year. I don't know if you guys have annual contracts, you might just see a lot of churn at the end of the 1st year, but there's almost always some kind of churn early in the customer, a peak in churn early in the customer life cycle, where people who, it wasn't a good fit for are just kind of dropping out. And for Clipfolio, they actually had a variety of contracts, I think monthly, quarterly, and annual. So you can actually see that there's kind of a little dynamic in the 1st year, but then after the 1st year, it basically starts going down long term. And that would also be the healthy, that's what you would expect to see also, I'm sure, for GitLab, that once people make it past their 1st year, they must get more and more invested, and churn should go down over time. Let's see, here's another one, which is active users and churn. And now note the shape of this curve really looks a lot like the one for the good reviews, right? That the curves all kind of look like this, that the lowest cohort has the highest churn. There's a steep drop off in the first couple of deciles, although there's not 10 deciles here either. If there's a lot of people at, at 0, you don't always get 10 cohorts in these plots. But so here you can clearly see that having around 5 active users is the target. And 1 active user is just terrible, because what does that mean? It means you've got some guy in a company making dashboards and no one's looking at them, right? That dashboard creator needs to get a few users if he wants the company to be more invested. So also, even better than the active users is actually seat utilization, because the active users is also correlated with the size of the customer. So you could have, a company that signs up for 100 seats, but only, 20 are being used. And you would think that 20 seats would be good. But if you go over to this chart and you see, oh, wow, only 20% of seats are being used, that's really bad. So again, like the ratio of the number of active users to the total possible number based on the number of seats sold is a really good metric, because that shows if they're getting a good value. Are they really taking advantage? Let's see, Clipfolio's top churn fighting moves. They also said no discounting. They reconfigured pricing and packaging. Clipfolio, I know, they even cut off their lowest tier. They reconfigured their pricing and packaging into tiers, and then they analyzed their tiers and found out that they were losing money on their bottom tier. So you might even do something like that, but still. Also, for them, more active users is key. And also they found high churn risk early on. So they gave 3 months free support. I don't know what GitLab does in that kind of thing. Although they're for smaller businesses. You guys probably have more support, I think. What do I know? Okay, last case study. Versature is voice over IP in Canada. So this is actually a telco. It's kind of interesting because, I mean, telcos were the first companies that really embraced churn and churn fighting as a thing. And so they have events that are calls, basically, local, international, and you can slice and dice them in various ways. So they make metrics out of how many calls do people make, of course, although we don't just look at the number of calls, we look at the total duration of calls. MRR, you guys know what that is, right? Because you're all in the SaaS industry. Sometimes I have to explain that. All right, so let's start looking at these. So this is, again, the really common curve to see that those customers who are practically not using the product over here are very much at risk of churn. In fact, some of them might have already decided to churn, and that's why their usage is so low. But then just getting a little bit more usage makes a big reduction in churn until you get to the elbow of the curve around 2,500. And also for customer success, these types of charts are really great for just picking out what's a healthy level of a metric, because that question comes up a lot of times. Like, what should be the target behavior of the user? And when you've got a curve like this with a sharp elbow, it's really easy to say, oh, look, 2,500 minutes per month, that's the target. And beyond that, look, it's not really doing you anything according to this one metric. So charts like this are great for targeting healthy levels. Now, what about cost? This is the result for MRR. So on the x-axis, this is the MRR, but I'm not showing you the actual amounts. This is normalized so that 0 is the average, and then 1 is 1 standard deviation above average, and -1 is -1 standard deviation below average. And that's because, in addition to that, I can't tell you about Versature's churn rate. I also can't tell you about their pricing. If you want to know about Versature's pricing, you should call one of their reps. They'll be happy to tell you. But so this is, basically anonymized data. But what is it saying? It actually says that people who pay more churn less. So there's the next trick question of the day. Why do people who pay more churn less? Isn't that weird?
The size of the customer?
Yeah, it's the same answer as before. The bigger customers.
I learned from Dave.
Yep. Customers who are on more expensive plans, they're bigger, so they're less likely to go bankrupt, for one thing. With small companies, you could always lose your customer to business failure. A big customer is not going to go out of business. Also, they invest more to get set up, and also once they're set up, they're just going to use it more. So whatever the value they're getting out of it, they're going to get more. So that all makes sense, but it's not very satisfying to just say, because what does that mean? Oh, raise the prices and people will churn less. No, don't. This is when you look at a better metric, which for Versature is the dollars spent per call that they make. And here you can actually see that this is also normalized. This does not mean like 0.5 or $1 per call. This is the average and 1 standard deviation above average. So clearly, if you're 1 standard deviation above average in cost per call, that's really bad for your churn. If you're below average, it doesn't matter so much. Like, there's all these people here who are well below average in the cost per call, they're good, and it doesn't actually make much difference for them. But so paying a lot in absolute terms does not cause churn. They're bigger customers, but paying too much for what you're using definitely causes churn. And the metrics that I always tell people to use is take whatever is your most important feature, whether for you guys it's like the repos managed or, I don't know, merge requests. I don't know what you guys would find, but take that and figure out like a dollar cost, like dollar cost per repo per month, dollar cost per commit per month. I guess it would just be pennies for most companies. But if the average cost per commit per month of a customer is like 1 cent, I guarantee you'll find some customer who's got like $1 because they're paying too much and they're not using the product, and they end up paying $1 per commit. You just think like, oh my God, $1 per commit. That's really, crazy. But you'll probably find some people like that. And those are the ones who are really at risk from paying too much and using too little. We saw that in Zora. In Zora, we looked at basically the price per invoice was one of our top churn metrics at Zora. And I can't tell you, of course, what anyone's prices per invoice are. But of course, when you look at the Zora data, there's a healthy range of the cost per invoice. And then there are just some crazy outliers for people who got sold a whole bunch of stuff they never got it implemented. And then those people are obviously very much at risk. So really good metrics for picking out people who aren't getting a good value on the product. All right, what else did Versature say? Identify customers early, focus on customer success. Again, they use their metrics for conversations. The metrics are not just good for detecting, they're good for just giving you a representation of where the customer is at. So when you get on the phone with them, you have some good conversation starters and you have a good sense of what their health is. All right, this was what I said post-COVID. Basically, you need to update your data. I remember I was giving this talk like a year ago, and I was telling people that the relationship between price and value might change over time. So it's good to, refresh your data. Let's see. All right. We also talked about pausing. Anyway, that's not so interesting for now. I think we're kind of out of the immediate post-COVID. We're just in the ongoing age of disruption at this point. So these were the top takeaways from the talk, which was, well, first, that customers are mostly rational. So reducing churn in the long run requires actually delivering something to them, something that's useful. That's back to that, there's no gimmicks in the long run. I mean, there are some quick fixes usually, but it's like in the form of bugs or, for very immature companies. A company like GitLab, I'm sure you guys don't have any bad bugs that are going to be quick fixes for churn. That's more like a consumer product is like, oh, we forgot to link the sign up. There's a bug in the sign up button or, something like that. Okay, so it helps if what you're doing is sticky, hard to switch. That's actually probably good news for GitLab because, oh my God, changing your repo, especially if you're using pipelines. I'm sure pipelines are like your stickiest feature because they're hard as hell to migrate. As an outside observer. Well, also a good thing to note for any SaaS company is your competition is not just your competitors, because there's lots of do-it-yourself solutions out there. I know for Zora, yeah, our biggest competitor was the IT department, who would be like, no, we'll do billing, don't worry. And for GitLab, you've probably got a lot of people who are like, oh no, we can make our own pipeline. What do we need this pipeline tool for? We can make a pipeline in-house, and that's your competition, Okay, main churn reducing strategies. We went over this: product improvement, engagement marketing, customer success, pricing for value, and targeting. Customer metrics are really the focus of, for me, the focus of using data and getting the right metrics in front of the right people, and a shared set of metrics was really the focus. Smart segmentation. You can predict churn. Really, anyone in the business can predict churn in a way just by having a good set of customer metrics and knowing how to read them. And the pro tip is that, yeah, a lot of really good metrics are ratios. Your metrics always start out from whatever events you're tracking. I don't know what system you guys use to track customer events. There's a lot out there like Segment or Omniture or just your own in-house, systems. But then actually surprisingly, taking the raw metrics, which are counts and sums, and dividing them to form ratios is a really good strategy because they're really intuitive too, actually. Ratio and rates are very intuitive ways to think about data and the relationship between two different measurements. So that's basically the presentation. I guess I probably kind of went like too long. I don't know if that's enough time for all the questions you guys might have. I haven't looked at that document.
Yeah, it's perfect. You answered a lot of questions, but it inspired many more questions. So I will get right to it. I tweaked the orders as well of the questions so everyone get to ask. So the first question from me: when you talk about the cohort analysis, you recommend we start from just the known features that are critical to the customers and do this analysis. And we, assuming at GitLab, we already did some initial analysis, we find a couple things that seems to be all correlating with long-term retention. My question is, what do we do from there? Sounds like you just transform that into ratio, which makes sense. But do we combine those factors into one formula, or do we keep them separate? And how do we understand one is more important than other? And like, yeah, what do we do from there?
Well, the most important thing is definitely to start making some interventions. Like, because, you know, having good metrics also isn't going to reduce churn. I mean, it's important. I mean, if you have some customer metrics already and you're pretty sure, you know, what is good and what is bad, then the question is that, yeah, it's definitely more important to think about how can you actually move the needle in getting people to adopt the good features that tend to be most valuable. It's definitely more important to put
actions.
Yeah, put basic knowledge into practice and then come up with more advanced metrics, you know, well, maybe at the same time, but also but definitely, I mean, the most basic level of doing, I think there was a question about this, like what's kind of like a basic level versus an advanced level. I mean, the first thing you have to do anything with churn is have customer metrics so that you can at least in some way know who's healthy and who's not and how you're going to target people. And yeah, after that, it's refinement.
So if we have, GitLab is a very complex product. I'm sure a lot of our customer success team members can relate. They are mapping out different use cases, and for each use case, there could be 10 features. And we can get to maybe we can reduce that, but still we likely will have, I don't know, 10 key features we want customers to use, and some customers use some customers use others. So in that situation, do we monitor all of them? Do we segment by each of them?
10 isn't too bad. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, many companies will track like 100 events or hundreds of different things, and then you really have to narrow it down to maybe like a dozen or less. But yeah, I mean, for a complex product, having on the order of 10 features that you're kind of monitoring and trying to promote isn't crazy. Definitely trying to do 50 or 100 would be crazy. And, you know, and the question of how to know which ones to start on is also, that's tough. And, you know, a lot of this, you need to just use your business knowledge and your other sources of information, you know, just your gut on what's the most important. I mean, from those charts, you can sometimes kind of see which ones make the most impact. I didn't actually show you that in this, because remember, I didn't show you any of the churn rates. But for a typical company, you will see which metrics have the biggest impact in reducing, well, the biggest correlation with reducing churn. But the thing to also think about is the cause and effect, because none of the data that I showed you shows you cause and effect. And I don't recommend using really advanced statistics to come up with the cause and effects. You really just have to think about the business and, you know, what's the use case for the customer? Where do they actually get value?
Cool. Thank you so much, Carl. And Mike, you have the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. And you kind of started to touch on this, I think, with the answer to the previous question, but I'm just wondering your opinion. What do you see as kind of the crawl, walk, run phases for leveraging data to fight churn? So it starts with, it sounds like having the metrics, and then interventions, and then what comes after that? Yeah,
well, there's a lot actually. Yeah, in the last chapter of the book, I actually go through the whole kind of like a crawl, walk, run framework without calling it that exactly. But definitely having customer metrics is like the most basic foundation. And if you don't have those, it's kind of hard to do much. The next level is putting those metrics together with the churn data to show, well, like in those charts we looked at, you know, what's the healthy level for each metric? And maybe you can tell which ones are most important just by looking at, you know, the shape of those curves. Because, you know, sometimes you really get surprises. You might have something where you're like, oh, I was sure this would reduce churn, but it only has like a really weak zigzaggy relationship, you know? So yeah, so basically getting the metrics together with churn data is the next step. And then the next step after that is doing something with that information, which is hard. And that's the part where in the book, I give the least concrete advice, because the data analysis, it's actually really remarkable. The data analysis is really standard across all these different companies that I worked with. But the plan of action after the data analysis is never standard, because it depends on what's your product, what's the technology stack, what's your budget. Do you have in-app messaging or just emails? Do you have a calls, or do you have a customer success team? And also, does your customer success team make one-on-one calls, or are they only going to do group actions? You probably have distinctions, and if you're like Zora, you probably have some customer success focused on high-value accounts where you're going to have a lot of calls, and then other customer success on your low-value accounts where you're going to try to do more mass actions, less expensive actions. So yeah, the actions to take, unfortunately, I have the least specific advice there. But anyway, taking action is definitely the next level. And then, kind of the most advanced level would be doing it all with more advanced analytics. Like if you've got it down that you can measure your customers, figure out what's related to churn, and take some action, then you might want to say, hey, if we used an AI model, would that improve our targeting? Given that you already kind of know what to do and have a good understanding of your customers from the more analytic approaches, kind of the last level would be AI, which again, it would really just improve your targeting with a little extra accuracy.
Yeah, cool. We have 3 more questions. Let's hopefully squeeze them with you.
I'll go quick.
Dave, you have the next one.
Great. Thanks so much, Carl. So you've already kind of partially answered this, but we've noticed that between stage adoption data, different user roles doing certain things, as well as like member invites, these are all deeply connected. I was just wondering, is there like a crawl approach to multilinearity that you'd recommend? It sounds like just intuition of the product might be useful here.
Actually, well, speaking of multilinearity, if you mean like actions that people take together, there's kind of a whole chapter in the book devoted to it, where I recommend one approach to grouping together related actions, which, for example, if it were a document editing website, you have editing and saving and copying and pasting. Guess what? Copying and pasting are highly correlated with editing documents. So I do recommend techniques to group those metrics together and make an overall score for each product area of correlated actions. That's kind of advanced too, but it's definitely, is that kind of what you meant?
So for example, we'll notice that certain user types will do certain stages. So the invite of that user kind of unleashes that stage being adopted, is one example.
Okay, so users at certain stages tend to do certain things together.
Yeah, I guess it's more like we have someone who is a PM, and he is only going to use the product features that's available for PM.
Oh, like for different personas.
And also, when someone invited him, right, he will begin to use those features. So for each single one, we observe correlation with retention, but they are actually also connected in a deeper level.
Yeah, it gets really hard. To get really so much in detail. And it depends on how many customers you have too. And as a SaaS, enterprise SaaS company, you guys are probably going to have challenges in the size of your data. I don't know how many customers GitLab has, but with Zora, they only have about 1,000 or so customers. So it's not like a consumer business where you have so many more data points to look at complicated correlations. So it gets pretty hard. It's also hard because churn happens at the account level, but there are interesting things going on at the user level. And usually you end up just having to make an account level metric for things going on at the user level, like as an aggregate. unless you can in theory make a model of user churn, but again, you need a lot of users and a lot of data, to look at individual users, stop, and then user churn just means that they stop using it.
Yeah.
So it's hard to get to that level of detail.
Yeah, for sure. Let's move on to the next question, Sam.
Go quick here. Thanks for taking the time, Carl. I'm curious within Zuora, of the data that Zuora customers give to Zuora, were there any trends that correlated to churn, like the named account owner in Zuora changing at a particular?
Oh God, we had a lot of debates over those things. And the problem was there was never enough data to really, we talked about the relationship of like account politics versus data-driven things. And people always, we all have observed, yeah, the account owner changes and then they churn. But we never had enough data to really strengthen that. And personally, I always took a utility-driven view of those, because the thing is, oftentimes the change in the person is just a trigger. If you look at it from the point of view of utility, if they were getting a great deal, why would they churn anyway? It might just be that they were only staying because the old manager had some vested interest, or they knew it well. And maybe the new person was just the first one to look at the data and be like, oh my God, you know how much we're paying for this? And then it's like, well, did they change because of the new person, or did they churn because of how much they were paying? And just the new person was the proximal person to notice,
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good insight.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, it was inconclusive. And believe me, we had that argument back and forth many times.
Yeah. Cool. Rebecca, you have the next question.
Yes, thank you. This is actually really exciting. Thanks for your time. And so my question one is, you mentioned that it's also common for people to just ignore the smallest tail, which you deem unsavable or just not worth it. There's 1 or 2 licenses, it's very small. But also our largest clients are the ones where we're seeing the least amount of churn. So where are you going to determine your focus? If, in my case, I'm renewal ops analyst, so I'm finding one-to-many approach. How can we save the tail end? If it's an easy fix, if it's a new button, if it's a wording, if it's onboarding emails, etc.
It could be. Definitely focusing on onboarding is what would help those new customers. That's the thing. Yeah, the thing is, definitely new customers is separate from people who have been on for a while and aren't using it. Definitely for new customers, you just want to focus on onboarding and getting them live and getting them to value, everything that everyone says. Yeah, and the statement about lost causes is more for people who at their renewal, if you're still seeing really low activity, like they haven't adopted it. I'm not saying you don't want to, I'm sure, because you guys are enterprise SaaS also, you have account managers. So a lot of this advice is for people who don't even have an account manager for, the client. I don't think I really answered the question though. What exactly was the question? Or
I guess the question is more on how do you determine your focus? So if I am an account executive and I have 200 SMB accounts, I know a tail end of them aren't going to churn, or they're going to churn no matter what, even if I send them an email.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, wherever you think you could get some traction. Usually people find it's in the mid-range, people who are kind of using it, but not fully healthy, and not the people who aren't even using it. But of course, the amount that their contract value has to play into this too. If you see a really big account and they're not using it, for God's sake, get on the phone. The advice to let the lost causes die, that really only applies in consumer, or, where everyone's equal, I should actually put in that caveat in this deck that advice really doesn't go when you have a big difference in the size of your accounts.
A very good point. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much. We're over time, and we really appreciate your time. It's so much great stuff, and we all benefited from learning from you. I'm sure you will have more books distributed among the team after today's session.
Cool. All right. Well, I enjoyed talking about it. So it was nice meeting you guys.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carl. Bye.
Okay. Bye.